Okay, I think our time has started, so please do settle down. We're about to get going. Thanks, everyone. Do settle down. Good to see you all.
We are here to discuss this book, The Sage Who Reimagined Hinduism, the life, lessons, and legacy of Sree Narayana Guru, by, of course, the well-known author and parliamentarian, and I do not have enough qualifications to describe him, Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you.
I do not know whether Shashi Tharoor needs to be introduced at all to you.
Let's save the
You
time.
know that he is a diplomat, he is a bureaucrat, an author, a political activist. He was the former secretary of the United Nations. And here, mainly because he is here because he is the author of several books, including this one that we are going to discuss. You may remember some of his books like An Era of Darkness or Why I Am a Hindu. Then the Hindu Way and Introduction, An Era of Darkness, and quite a few others, both fiction and non-fiction. We have quite a few, only very few writers who practice both, writing both, and Shashi is easily one of them, one of the greatest of them, really. And you know, novels like The Great Indian Novel and the Show Business and The Riot, all of which are quite well known to readers of English fiction. I don't generally say Indian English fiction, but I would say English fiction. I believe it is extremely significant, especially at this point of time, that Shashi has chosen to write this book on Sree Narayana Guru. Not that there are no books on the Guru. We have some books in English and quite a few more in Malayalam. But when Shashi writes a book on Guru, it assumes a very special kind of importance and relevance because he is himself a very popular author. And I'm sure more people, especially outside Kerala, will get to know Guru much more closely than they did earlier by reading this book. So if I can do some advertisement, I request all of you also to buy this book.
Yes, please.
Sree Narayana Guru, because it's a very comprehensive kind of book where he deals with almost every aspect of the Guru. As a philosopher, as a social activist, as a great reformer, as one of the pioneers of Kerala's Renaissance, and of course as a great poet too. So he has dealt with almost all these aspects of the Guru, and that's how this book becomes comprehensive in every sense. Maybe we should begin discussing or by asking you what prompted you to write this book at this particular juncture in Indian life, because as you know, we are all passing through not so good times. Yeah.
There are a number of elements that made me do this. One was the fact that over the years, having now been a political representative amongst the people of Travancore, of Thiruvananthapuram in particular, having realized the extraordinary impact and influence of Sree Narayana Guru. There is a shrine to him in practically every street corner, every neighborhood in my constituency. I was struck by the fact of the extraordinary gap between the pervasive presence of Sree Narayana Guru and his ideals and his life in my part of Kerala and in the rest of India. I'm constantly going to other parts of India, and if I tell people about Sree Narayana Guru, I get a blank stare. It's astonishing. I don't think there is a comparable case in India where there is such a gap between the local awareness of a giant and the national consciousness of his achievements. So that was one thing that struck me as very significant. How do I get the story of this life and his teachings and his extraordinary message to all of us to a non-Malayali audience outside Kerala? And that became the first motivation. The second motivation, I will admit, is the success of my two short biographies, one on Nehru and one on Ambedkar. In all these cases, including Sree Narayana Guru, there are, as Satchidanandan said, a lot of books already out there in Indian languages, but also in the case of all three of them, there are voluminous and high quality biographies, but they're all incredibly dense, very long. The best biography of Nehru, Sarvapalli Gopal's, is multi-volumes. Ambedkar himself wrote more than anyone can read and digest. Sree Narayana Guru attracts very serious but often very abstruse commentary. So the question is, how do you tell the story of the life and the lessons in a short and accessible form? And the feeling was that this is something I'd been able to pull off twice, so why not a third time? And that became the literary argument for doing it. And finally, over the years, I've been going every year to the Shivagiri pilgrimage. I'm one of the speakers there for the last 16, 17 years, except for COVID. And the Swamis had been saying to me, you write so many books, why not one about the Guru? And that kept me thinking. And then the Swamis in charge of the ashram said, we will give you material, we will give you books that we respect, we'll give you material for you to look at. And that also became a third incentive. So all of these things came in together. And then, of course, when I started writing, I realized that I was going to have a hard stop in my writing life for a few months as the Kerala elections were looming. So the deadline became, I've got to finish this before I get distracted by the election campaigning and all the activities before that. So I rushed to finish this and have it published by the end of the year. The Vice President of India was gracious enough to launch it on the first day of the Shivagiri Tirtharanam, the December 30th, the first day of the pilgrimage. And I myself spoke at the pilgrimage about the book on the 1st of January, so it was a great beginning to the new year. This is the English edition. The Malayalam edition is still a few days away, and I'll probably be releasing that at the Madhrubhumi Festival in Thiruvananthapuram. But the extraordinary thing about being here is that we get an audience from all over the country. I've just been signing books after my previous session, and I was struck by the number of people who've come to Kozhikode from all other parts of the country. And I hope some of them are in this audience because they are also the readers I want to reach. It's a short book, an accessible book. Some people joke it's written for the TikTok generation in the sense that it doesn't demand a very lengthy immersion in the work. But it's got all the major events and issues in his life. It's got a distillation of the lessons he taught without going into very, very abstruse philosophical concepts. And of course, it has got my assessment of the legacy today, because I believe what he taught us remains relevant to the India of today and the world of tomorrow.
Thank you. You seem to begin the book with that dramatic episode of the installation of the idol at Aravipuram. Of course, it was a remarkably important historical event, because when he was questioned by the Brahmins, what right he had to install an idol, especially the idol of Shiva, he said, well, I have installed an Irava Shiva, a Shiva who...
Actually, he said in Malayalam, he said, Nammude Shiva, which itself raised the question, if Shiva can be yours and mine, then what are you doing to Shiva? So, in fact, it was a very subversive act, while being at the same time a very reverential and respected act. So, why did I begin with that? You asked, Sachi. The honest truth is that I wanted the book to have an arresting, compelling beginning. And I always thought that a story is the best way to capture people's attention. So I said, where does one begin? Not at the beginning, nor at the end, but somewhere in the middle. And the middle story is the one of Aravipuram, which of course is substantively a huge moment. Because as I describe it, I begin the novel with, the book with a novelistic account almost of the episode, building up the atmosphere and what he does, how he does it, and then the reaction, as such he says, of the Brahmin saying, who are you to consecrate an idol? What gives you the right? His reaction, well, it's our Shiva, which immediately raises the question, how can the Brahmins arrogate Shiva to themselves? If Shiva is the all-pervasive divine figure, then obviously he belongs to all of us. And that was a very, very dramatic realization. Then, by the way, some of the Brahmins said, but it was an inauspicious time. He doesn't even know what time to do this. And he tartly responded, a horoscope should be cast after the birth of the child and not before. And you can see the horoscope of the Shiva in the future. And needless to say, as I go on to describe, it was a moment in Kerala's social and spiritual history, akin to the moment where Jesus drives the money changers out of the temple, or in more recent years when Rosa Parks refuses to get down from the bus when she's in a seat that blacks are not supposed to occupy in America. There are these moments that mark sea changes in a state or a local areas or a country's social history. And that's what happened with the consecration at Aravipuram. So I have one simple sentence: Kerala would never be the same again. And then I go into a history of why this was so necessary, the extraordinary level of discrimination that was being practiced in Kerala society at that time, the ridiculous levels of discrimination of which I've gone into some detail, and the fact that by doing this, he was asserting humanity, the right to freedom, the right to be human. And to my mind, it was an extraordinary act. And of course, then I go on to talk about how Kerala has transformed itself since that moment of rebellion and the whole Kerala Renaissance, which Sachi has also written about in his own way over the years. So we have a whole social transformation that takes place in Kerala, and it begins, I thought, from that magical moment. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure at least some of you have been to Aravipuram and seen the temple where it is written that there is no caste here, no religion, and it is just a human temple in a profound sense. Now, we will discuss some of the subtler aspects of Narayana's philosophy and also maybe his poetry, which in fact is extremely difficult to separate one from the other, because Narayana often wrote poems which were deeply philosophical. And when he was philosophical, he was also being poetic. And as you know, he was a trilingual poet who could write in Sanskrit and in Tamil and in Malayalam equally easily. Now, one question I wanted to ask, which has always haunted me, and I have also found my own answer, is what is the difference in the interpretations of Advaita by someone like Shankara or even Vivekananda and Sree Narayana? How do they interpret it? Because I feel that it's different. And do you feel, of course, Advaita is the root, but it seems Narayana is giving a more human kind of interpretation
Correct.
to
So,
Advaita.
you know, in many ways, Vivekananda is a perfect transition between the two. Though they were actually contemporaries. Vivekananda, Aravipuram happened in 1888. Vivekananda visited Kerala in the early 90s. So, in fact, they were roughly contemporaneous in their analysis of Kerala and how Advaita would apply there. But I'll come to that in a second. Let me answer Sachi's question directly. Adi Shankara, the original Shankaracharya, 1,000 years before Narayana Guru, had basically revived Hinduism for the first time at a time when it was completely beleaguered by Buddhism and Jainism, particularly Buddhism, by an emphasis on doctrine and theology. His philosophical understanding of Hinduism and its myriad texts was stripped down to the essence of a few selected texts, particularly the Brahma Sutras, some of the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and so on. And then Adi Shankara came up with this notion of Advaita Vedanta. That is, the end of the Vedas is Vedanta. And Advaita is non-dualism. Up to then, the prevailing orthodoxy within Hinduism was dualism, the separation between man and God, right, which is very present in many of the Semitic religions. Whereas what Shankara preached was essentially, we all possess the Atman, the soul, the self, whose ultimate objective is to merge into the Brahman, the universal cosmic consciousness. And in that process, there is no difference. That what we worship as God is ourselves. Tattvamasi. The whole idea that even our namaskaram, as you know, is recognizing the divinity within the person you are namaskara killing. And so the whole idea that Adi Shankara taught is the divine is us, is within us, and we are in the divine. And that idea was a very profound idea, but Adi Shankara stayed at the philosophical level. Vivekananda and Narayana Guru took it one step forward into the world of society and the world of translated action. Adi Shankara revived Hinduism through what you might call Jnana Yoga. Jnana was his knowledge was his paradigm. He actually succeeded in establishing his sway over modern Hindu thought through a series of debates. He traveled through the country debating those who were Advaita philosophers, and he prevailed. He won those debates. And then he established mutts in all corners of the country. That was his great legacy, and of course, he's extraordinarily well known. Narayana Guru, on the other hand, did not venture much beyond South India and a couple of visits to Sri Lanka. He essentially remained a figure in our part of the world, which is partly why he's so unknown elsewhere. But what he did was to directly translate jnana into karma yoga, into action. And he understood the need to use bhakti as the bridge between jnana and karma by consecrating the 50 temples or so that he did across the state. Now, why do I tell you the story? Because the only difference really philosophically is that Sree Narayana Guru applied Advaita to the world of action. And Swami Vivekananda came there himself. He started off as a spiritual disciple of Ramakrishna Paramahansa. He learned his entire Advaita philosophy. He started preaching in English around the country and eventually around the world. And of course, he traveled the length and breadth of the country as well to expound. And as he traveled, he began asking. Here's a wonderful statement by Vivekananda saying, if it would be so much more useful for me to go to these villages and teach them science and mathematics rather than teaching them religion. Vivekananda said this. So he was already beginning to say how we have to transform thinking into self-improvement of society. Narayana Guru took that much further. Narayana Guru not only introduced this radical idea that because we are all possessors of fragments of the same Atman, you cannot discriminate since we are all the same. Now, this is an insight that we've heard also in the story of Adi Shankara, but it was not his principal work. There is a wonderful episode when Adi Shankara is walking in Benares and he is crossing a bridge, and coming in the opposite direction is a Chandala, what today we would call a Dalit, an untouchable figure, quote unquote. So as Adi Shankara is walking this way, the followers with him shout out to the Chandala, make room for the great sage, move aside. But the Chandala doesn't move. He stands his place and he says to Adi Shankara, what do you want me to move? My body or my Atman? Isn't the Atman within me the same as the Atman within you? And Adi Shankara says, embrace the Chandala, saying that you have understood my teachings far better than my own followers have. So Adi Shankara also would have drawn the same conclusion Narayana Guru did, but Narayana Guru practiced it. He actually consecrated the Shivalingam at Aravipuram. He actually established 50 temples where all were allowed entry. All castes, all religions for that matter, anyone could come. He consecrated temples where there were mirrors in some cases. The mirror was a reminder that God is within yourself. There was the word, there was Om written on some of the mirrors, on a lamp in other places. So the idea is you can worship many things. And when the pilgrimage was to be started towards the end of his life, he decreed, and I've got an account of the conversation he had with his disciples, he decreed that it's not enough for people to come and pray at a temple and go away. Religion cannot only be about man and God, it has also got to be about self-improvement, about human freedom, human self-realization. And so he said, in the Tirtharana, in the Shivagiri pilgrimage, you absolutely have to have lectures about what? About education, about business, handicrafts, agriculture, science and technology. It's something that's very little known, even in Kerala, is that the first All India crafts exhibition was held by Sree Narayana Guru in 1904. So that people could come and display their wares. He wanted to get people to succeed in the real world. So that would be the essential difference. Adi Shankara stayed at a level of intellect, of knowledge, of theology, of spiritual consciousness. Sree Narayana Guru did not disagree with Adi Shankara, but took it a step further into the real world, into social transformation, into applying Advaita to caste discrimination, and into things like business, enterprise, handicrafts, and so on, so that people would actually rise above the limitations forced upon them by birth.
Good that you brought up the story in the setting of Benares about the meeting between the Chandala and Adi Shankara. Perhaps you know there is a very similar story in North Kerala, and there is a Theyyam based on that, where again a Chandala or somebody who is untouchable or
In
unseeable,
those days, even
as
the
you
Ujjwala
say.
community was deemed untouchable.
Yeah, yeah,
So large majority of Keralites were untouchable.
yeah.
That's how
So
iniquitous the system.
yeah, where the untouchable person says that okay, if you wound me, it is the same blood that comes, and if you are hurt, again the same blood comes, and we are of the same blood. So obviously Narayana had this kind of discrimination in mind when he spoke of Advaita. It was not purely like aham brahmasmihi, putting an end to all the kind of binaries, but also saying that you, the other human being, is also like me, and we are the one. Because there was no otherness, or in Malayalam, abaratva, in other people. You are me. While Shankara said mainly that, Brahma and we are one, Narayana emphasized this fact that all human beings are one, and you or I, we both are ultimately the same. So there is as he very well said, there is a greater emphasis on the human value of Advaita. He brings Advaita down to the earth and makes it a popular philosophy, a philosophy of the people. And that helps him also end all kinds of discrimination based on varna and of caste. So that obviously brings us to the next question, which you have already touched upon. How do you look at the kind of social reforms that Guru brought, and how do you connect his spirituality with his social action? Because he speaks against all forms of untouchability, and I think you use words like unseeability and unshadowability, which I immensely loved. Unshadowability, because even your shadow should not fall on the Brahmin. Even that is supposed to be a sin. And so how does that struggle really connect with spirituality in a very deeper sense? I mean, in a deeper sense, I would say it was also spiritual.
So Sree Narayana Guru did all of that. He attacked, of course, the illogicality of discrimination of all of human creation. If there is this philosophical understanding that we are all the same, then that should extend to the social practices. We should not discriminate against each other. And he set the example amongst his own followers and sannyasins. There were people of every caste. And in all his temples, there was no restriction on entry. Anyone could come and pray. And so the important message there was that it didn't really matter how you reached out to God. All ways of reaching God were equal. Vivekananda had a very similar argument. In fact, Vivekananda used to quote the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, which says that just as many rivers, some straight, some winding, some flow down hills, some go through valleys and dales, all end up in the same sea, so also, he said, all forms of worship end in the same divine, or the same Brahman, we might say. And that idea was very much implicit in Narayana Guru's actions. But I think the other dimension that we have stressed, Sachi, is the practical one. He constantly, for example, his emphasis on literacy. His schools were open to everyone, but they were schools. At one point, after he had consecrated these 50 temples or so, he said, enough of temples. We've got temples now, let's make sure we have schools. The creation of schools to which everybody could be admitted was fundamental. If you just look at the census figures for the literacy of, take the Ujjwala caste, it was something like 3% in 1891. By 1901, it's only about 7%. Then it keeps going up, 11, 21. By the time Sree Narayana Guru's death, it's something like 41%. And of course, we all know that the whole movement towards literacy in Kerala that gathered pace had been given an impetus by people like him and Mahatma Ayyankali. And they ended up in the end with Kerala becoming the first state in the country to achieve essentially universal literacy. The whole idea, the emphasis on literacy and education, he wasn't just content with literacy, he wanted education. He wanted people to take an interest in science and technology and in business and entrepreneurship. He was very keen on entrepreneurship. He tried to move people away from some of their traditional caste-linked professions. In the case of the Ujjawalas in the 19th century, they were identified with toddy tapping. So move away from all that. Do something more useful. Learn businesses, learn entrepreneurship. And he encouraged and supported all that. It was a very practical, socially transformative sort of exercise that he was conducting through his efforts in educating society. And there's a very wonderful story which, links, if you like, both society and theology, if you want. In the 1921 census, the census takers came to him and said, we're writing down all your details and so on. What is your caste? And Sree Narayana Guru said, human. They said, so we know that. We have to write down, what is your jati? And he said, human. So he said, sir, but we have these choices. There is a box on the form. I have to fill it. What should I write? And Sree Narayana Guru looked at the census takers and said, write human. And to this day, he remains the first Indian to have ever been recorded in a census as human. That is Sree Narayana Guru's extraordinary. And that story is also in the book, as are some of the discussions of not just unshadowability and untouchability. You know that untouchables couldn't even enter a marketplace to buy essential goods. Either they had to find an upper caste person to buy the goods for them, or they had to shout out that they were there, leave money on the floor or on the table. The merchant would come and drop the goods, but they would never touch each other. This was the kind of incredible discrimination. You've all heard about Anjali and Muppadari, how many feet you have to stand from each caste and all that nonsense. But in addition to that, there was a level of practical discrimination that had infected our society in ways you can't imagine. For example, within the Dalit community, both oil crushers and oil mongers, those who were selling the oil, were untouchable. But within them, there was a hierarchy. And apparently, those who sold the oil were of a higher subcaste within the Dalit caste, or within the Dalit community, than those who crushed the oil. Can you imagine the kind of ridiculous extent of discrimination? There were subcastes that wouldn't marry each other if they lived across a road from each other. There's bizarre sorts of practices. And the challenge in that kind of Kerala to fundamentally attack the roots of the caste system, to persuade people that none of this was relevant, that all these, what they had been brought up to believe was the sanctified practices of society, that you should reject that and rebel against it, that was a tremendous achievement that we can't today, when we are amongst the most progressive states in the country, we Keralites can't understand what it was like. But it was amongst the least humane societies just 125 years ago.
Yeah, that reminds me of one of our critics who was also a social critic, P.K. Balakrishnan, whose name many of you must have heard, once suggesting that perhaps the subcaste system is even darker and more cruel than the caste system.
Exactly.
And of course, Guru was very much aware of that, the caste within the caste. And so first to remove that, and then to remove the caste, and then to move to the Varna. I think he worked at all the levels of discrimination between man and man. I'm using man not in the
Not in the gendered sense.
Human being, between human beings. So I am asking one question, not for me actually, it's not my question, but somebody has told me to ask you why you have given some importance to the kind of miracles that Sree Narayana Guru seemed to have somehow worked.
I mean, the two reasons, Sachi.
How do you think of prayer? Because I also believe that prayer is a kind of strong desire and nothing more than that. So,
no, the short answer is that, number one, these stories are told about Guru. You talk to people who are devotees of Guru, who not just revere him, but worship him practically. And you will hear these stories, how there is a barren jackfruit tree, somewhere he embraces it, it starts generating jackfruit. Or when he was 6 years old, there is this drought that has afflicted the land is parched. He starts chanting these self-composed verses to Ardhanarishwara, and suddenly the heavens open up and rain falls, and all the people of the village treat him as a miracle worker. There are stories like this. Now, I tell the stories for two reasons. First of all, in a biography, you really need to embrace pretty much everything you hear, anecdotally as well as published sources. So there is the serious stuff and there is the anecdotal stuff as well. But equally, it seems to me that in a popular biography, I'm not trying to write a book for scholars or theologians. I'm trying to write a book that makes Sree Narayana Guru interesting for people who have never heard of him. And that's something that these stories also contribute towards. So the book is full of anecdotes. While I try to also bring in all the philosophical stuff that Sachi has been asking about, I thought that it's important to tell these anecdotes. And I always say, many of these things, the readers may consider, they might be skeptical about it, they may not even find it credible, but it doesn't matter. It is a fact that these stories are being told that give you a sense of the way in which the man is revered. I mean, Sree Narayana Guru never claimed to be a miracle worker. And the stories were told about him. He never claimed any credit for it. In fact, he had a very practical and slightly cynical streak. There was some disciple came to him and told him about how he was going to do various Ayurvedic kriyas and potions to get his digestive system in order because the chap was suffering from what. And Sree Narayana Guru smiled at him and said, wouldn't a teaspoon of castor oil do the same thing? So he was, very relaxed and rationalist and practical as well. And that anecdote is also in the book. So it's not that I've only tried to portray him from one angle. I've tried to give all of these stories.
Yeah, I think that answers the question very well. Well, among the various Renaissance figures of Kerala, of course, Guru holds a prime place. Along with that, we had quite a few others like Chattambi Swamigal or Poigail Appachan or Ayyangali or Dakshayani Velayathan and quite a lot of others. Do you find a difference in degree or in the form in which all these figures acted? In some sense, they acted together to create what we now call Kerala's Renaissance.
Yeah.
But what was the difference between Guru's way and the way that others seem to have?
Well, I would say that in some ways, closest, oddly enough, would be Chattambi Swami, who was actually from the Nayar caste, was therefore an upper caste person who did not suffer any of these discriminations. But he, theologically, philosophically, he and Narayana Guru actually met, spent some time together, and arguably they agreed philosophically on a lot of things. But Narayana Guru moved on, and he moved on partially out of this urgent sense to transform society. If you look at Ayyankali, who also met Narayana Guru, but Narayana Guru was already by then a well-known guru. Ayyankali was still a young man. He came to Narayana Guru and presented himself. There's a very brief account that I've come across of their meeting. But Ayyankali focused entirely on social activism. You may be aware, for example, that he violated every rule he could that was discriminatory against the Dalit community. He was a Pulayan, and particularly against the subcaste. So you could not ride a bullock cart, he rode a bullock cart. You could not wear a turban or a hat, he wore one. You could not go to school, he started establishing schools. Ayyankali's emphasis is overwhelmingly on society. You don't read much of theology from Ayyankali, and you certainly don't read much of the kind of philosophical Advaitic discussions that I'm sure Chattambi Swami and Narayana Guru would have had. So Chattambi Swami, more emphasis on theology, philosophy, and ideas. Ayyankali, more emphasis on social action. Narayana Guru, both. So that would be the major difference that I see. There are, of course, other figures in the Kerala Renaissance. And in all fairness, when it comes to education, one must acknowledge the role of the Christian missionaries who had brought education to all castes and communities from the 1840s onwards. Look at the extraordinary life of Saint Kuriakose Chavara, Elias Kuriakose Chavara. That was an extraordinary contribution also, and he should be counted also amongst the figures of the Kerala Renaissance. And you'll find other cases in other faiths. Vakka Maulavi is very much somebody who has every claim to be seen as part of this fundamental rethinking of both religion and society and social practice that I would say took place effectively from the 1880s to the 1920s. Thereafter, you have a different kind of transformation of Kerala society with the rise of the communists and all of that. And we can go into, I've touched on it briefly towards the end of the book. But the period of Sree Narayana Guru's extraordinary flourishing, which is the 1880s to the 1920s, is what I focused on in this book. And that's what makes him, as Sachi says, the principal, the primary figure of the Navodhanam, of the Kerala Renaissance. And I would further argue, when you look at and I mentioned it in my preface to the book, when you look at the polls that were conducted around December 1999 by both Manorama and Madhrubhumi for the greatest Malayali, it's not surprising that it was Narayana Guru who won hands down, way more than anybody else, for the impact it had on Kerala and Kerala society. So we have recognized his contributions, as I said, both in theory and in practice.
Yeah, quite a few people, including atheists and rationalists, or rather atheists and rationalists, have asked, why did Guru found temples at all? Why did he install idols? Why should there be temples at all? And in fact, Guru himself has answered it, saying that, well, first there will be a temple, then there will be a school close to the temple, then there will be a small industry coming up near the temple. And so he said the temple was the beginning, and that's the only way in which a reform could begin in India. Gandhi also always, began with piety and spirituality and all that. But his ultimate aim was to go beyond it, to reform the entire society. And so how do you look at his faith, if at all he had faith in temples, and what
So
did they really
don't
do?
forget that the first thing he realized was that people had a desire to worship. He himself, as a child, had gone to a temple and been denied admission and had sat outside the temple wrapped in contemplation and prayer and in thought. So it's something he had personally experienced because, as I said, in those days, even the Yuva community, which today in government bureaucratic language is considered OBC, in those days was treated as untouchable. And having suffered that kind of discrimination, he realized it mattered to people to be able to worship. And therefore, for him, establishing temples was a direct assault on the bar that had been imposed artificially by society on so many members of our society. So that was the first reason he did it. He quickly tired. I mean, he was in great demand to establish temples. In fact, I had erroneously written 30 temples in the book. I've now been told by a scholar that actually the real figure is closer to 50. That he established all those temples, but he very quickly realized this wasn't enough. And by 1904, for example, he started establishing Sanskrit schools in Aravipuram and in Varkala. The idea being that education is important. In all fairness, again, that is an insight that the Christians had had. Pallidappam Pallikudam, that is, you have a church and you adjoining the church, you have a school. That idea, which the Christians had introduced into Kerala, was very similar to the logic of Sree Narayana Guru says, let's get them to do something they feel the lack of, namely a temple, but then let's link it to something that will improve their lot in life. When you are suffering discrimination, you are very conscious of the most visible daily humiliation of not being able to go to a temple. But Sree Narayana Guru's insight is you need much more than that. The temple is only a first step, and that's philosophically, and for a scholar and a sannyasin like him, that's vital. But thereafter, what you need is the ability, let's face it, to be able to make a decent livelihood for yourself and your family, to improve your standing in society. So the negative standing doesn't only come from discrimination, but from all the disabilities that discrimination has caused you, including poor financial means and other things. And so for him, all three went together. Temple, education, and business or entrepreneurship. All were important, and this is something that I think was one of his great insights. Adi Shankara certainly never went there. Even Swami Vivekananda, though he talked about the importance of education, stopped there. He never got into things like livelihood, which Sree Narayana Guru did. So these are all very complementary figures, whether the three Kerala examples we talked about a few minutes ago or the three national examples I'm just mentioning. They're all complementary. There is no contradiction. But in many ways, Narayana Guru is the person who took them 1-2 steps further.
Yeah, there were two, reformers from other religions. We had somebody like Makti Tangal from the Islamic section of the society. So we had people from every caste, and in fact, if you look at the disciples of Narayana Guru, or who Guru considered his disciples, you will find people from different religions, even though finally they all were.
I mentioned a number of names and their castes, so you can find Nambudiris and Nayars and everyone.
Yeah. So for him, and he was once asked, when you spoke about Palli, I just remembered, he was once asked, why do you install only Hindu idols, maybe Shiva or whoever, Then he said, no, if the Christians ask me to lay the foundation stone for a church, I will do that. If the Muslims approach me to lay the foundation stone for a mosque, I'll do that. So ultimately, he wanted to lead the whole society to a level where religious divisions and caste divisions were alike irrelevant. So he went step by step. He was extremely practical, and he knew that he didn't want to alienate several sections of society by starting with a very rational kind of philosophy. So obviously, Guru had towards the end, he said, I have no caste, I have no religion even. So it's quite possible he dreamt of a human society where these divisions did not exist or did not mean anything at all. You also speak about the movement of Narayana Guru from Nanu to Nanu Ashan to Nanu Swami to Sree Narayana Guru. Nanu Swami was, of course, Sree Narayana Guru too. So how do you look at the evolution of his mind, his thought, his philosophy, which always went with social action?
Very true, but at the same time, I didn't want to go into great detail on the evolution of the mind and philosophy, because then you get into territory which can be fairly abstruse and which honestly many of the kind of readers I'm targeting would not have been able to cover. For example, I've got a paragraph mentioning the amazing work of a scholar called G.K. Shashi Tharoor, who has written 2 very fat volumes, 600-700 pages each, that I've got from Penguin, India, which are so profoundly philosophical in understanding Sree Narayana Guru's philosophical musings. And his theory is that Sree Narayana Guru was a pioneer of the whole notion of quantum entanglement. Now, you don't get me to go there, because once I start discussing quantum entanglement, I will lose half the general readers I'm trying to reach with this book. So I mentioned this in one paragraph, and I have a footnote saying this book doesn't have room to go into all this, but here is the book, here is the reference, you can read it. So, I have not gone as much into the direction that Sachi's last question implies. Yes, the early Narayana Guru, the childhood in the village, the education, the extraordinary education. He was really a remarkable student as well. Then his learning, he actually taught for a while, became Nanu Ashan. Then he went off, gave up all that, wandered off, sat in a cave in Marutumala for 6-7 years, and then came out of it as a self-realized guru. So that evolution is described, and that's again told in a very anecdotal way, so all of you can read it as a story and enjoy it. But the sophisticated philosophical thinking that is evident in the metaphysical poetry that he wrote, the songs he composed, the lectures he gave, all of that is beyond the scope of the book. I've given a very short summary, I think it's chapter 18, where I've literally tried to summarize in 2-3 lines each some of his major works that everyone has heard of. But I'm not trying to write a work of philosophy here. I've only chosen the points of philosophy that are relevant to an appreciation of the social transformation that Narayana Guru brought about. And so it's the Guru of action as well that matters to me. Yes, you need the spiritual understanding, you need the Advaita, you need the grasp of the whole theological narrative, and that's there in its essence. But far more is the Guru of action, the man who took this insight that all human beings are one, that Advaita has taught him, and that he then develops into a philosophy of society and of social action that says everyone has the right to be human, to be free, to develop their own potential, and to achieve self-realization. And to do so also through education, enterprise, business, human activity, handicrafts, all of which he emphasizes, because that's how people are going to pull themselves out and up from the lowly lot to which they have been consigned by an unjust society, and they're going to have an opportunity to transform themselves. It's a fascinatingly interesting worldview, and I think when you look at the life lessons and legacy of Narayana Guru, there is so much that is still relevant to today's India, where unfortunately, particularly in parts of the north where his teachings have not reached, there is still a lot of caste discrimination and even oppression. And at the same time, the realization that the kinds of transformations that you need to bring about in society and economy are transformations that also serve this larger divine, if you like, theological purpose. So in that sense, the book offers a holistic story. And I think what he's taught us is relevant to the rest of the world. It's not just for us as Indians. And indeed, he's now being embraced more and more by people who become aware of his work, which is why I wrote the book, as I said, is to get more people aware of him in other parts of India outside the Malayali community. But at the same time, the message is something that India can take to the world, just as we've taken Gandhiji's message. It's a terrific message against discrimination, against xenophobia, the kind of racism we're seeing against immigration in so many Western countries. I'm sure I know exactly where Sree Narayana Guru would have stood on that. And therefore, you're talking about somebody whose lessons are not only timeless, they're also universally applicable and not just confined to our geography.
I think we need to give some time to the audience too to raise questions, before which I'll just ask what I consider my final question, even though I have quite a few questions. Of course, and also I have noticed the novelist in you working behind the narrative technique of the whole book. The question I wanted to ask, which I have been asking myself, is how do we look at the relationship, including, which begins perhaps with a conversation between Gandhi and Guru. So how do we look at these two as leaders who were different, but who had also several things in common? And maybe the same question could be asked also about somebody who was older, Buddha. The Buddha too spoke about compassion, about about Karuna, Maitri, Mudidam, Upeksha, and all that. And to a great extent, Guru also, whether he actually read all those conversations that Buddha had, he also seems to have advocated quite a few of these values. So just evaluate in brief the significance of Guru in the context of Buddha in the past and Gandhi, who was his contemporary to some extent.
Yeah, he certainly was inspired by his reading of Buddhism, and he was very, very much in agreement with some of the points you mentioned, so I won't repeat that. It's in the book and you can see it. On Gandhiji also, there's some detail because there was a certain division sought to be created over the Vaikam Satyagraha, for example, where Sree Narayana Guru felt that pure passive resistance, sitting in front of the barricades and allowing yourself to be arrested and carted off to jail, would not achieve anything, and that the satyagrahis should ideally climb over the barricades and go into the temples. And this began to be misrepresented as a disagreement, for example, over non-violence or himsa. He didn't disagree, and he clarified his position. He's not in favor of violence, but what he was suggesting was a more assertive approach. In any case, Gandhiji and he met, and the accounts of the meeting, which I've also described in the book, you're welcome to read, Gandhiji was hugely impressed by Narayana Guru. He was impressed by the fact that in his temples, there were priests of all castes, which Gandhiji had not realized was possible. He was impressed by the fact that in the schools, there was no discrimination. Everyone could study from all castes. And finally, he was also impressed by Guruji agreeing about non-violence. And he wrote in the visitor's book how much respect he had for the Guru. It's also fair to say that the meeting was somewhat handicapped, first of all, by this earlier misunderstanding over the Satyagraha, and secondly, by the fact that they had no language in common. Guruji spoke Sanskrit, Tamil, and Malayalam. Gandhiji spoke many languages, but none of these three. And so there was nothing they could speak directly to each other. It had to be through a Malayalam translator, and something may have been lost. And a lot of the meeting even passed in profound silence, I'm told. But broadly speaking, there were some important differences, and one which I'll mention because it came up in the context of the Vaikam Satyagraha. Gandhiji saw untouchability as a sin for Hindus alone to expiate. He saw it as a flaw within the Hindu religion that Hindus had to deal with. So, for example, Gandhiji wrote to George Joseph, saying that the Christians should not lead the Satyagraha because it was not a Christian problem, it was a Hindu problem. Well, Narayana Guru never accepted these distinctions. For him, it's a social problem, everyone an equal stake in asserting equality. But given the fact that the clock is running out, and we did begin a few minutes late, I'm going to stop there and say, if you're interested in this issue, there's a lot about it in the book.
Hello, sir. Big fan of yours.
Thank you.
Actually, sir, 25 books I have read from library and all. അപ്പോൾ ഈ ഒരു ബുക്ക് ഇറങ്ങിയ സമയത്ത് ഞാൻ സാറിനോട് മലയാളത്തിൽ സംസാരിക്കാൻ ആഗ്രഹിക്കുന്നു. കാരണം എല്ലാവരും ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ സംസാരിക്കാൻ കേൾക്കുന്നവരുന്ന് സാർ മലയാളത്തിൽ സംസാരിക്കുന്നത് കേൾക്കാനും എല്ലാവരും ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൻ്റെ കാര്യത്തിൽ അറിയപ്പെടുന്ന സാറിനെ കൊണ്ട് മലയാളത്തിൽ സംസാരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത് കാര്യത്തിലും എനിക്ക് ഭയങ്കര സന്തോഷമുണ്ട്.
ശരി. അല്ല, ഈ പുസ്തകം ഞാൻ മലയാളികൾക്ക് വേണ്ടിയിട്ടല്ല എഴുതിയത്. മലയാളികൾക്ക് ഇതൊക്കെ അറിയണം എന്നാണ് എൻ്റെ അഭിപ്രായം. പക്ഷേ പബ്ലിഷേഴ്സ് പറഞ്ഞു ഈ പുസ്തകം മാതൃഭൂമിക്കാരാണ് മലയാളത്തിൽ ഇറക്കുന്നത്. അവർ പറഞ്ഞു അത് മലയാളികൾക്കും ഇൻട്രസ്റ്റിംഗ് ആയിരിക്കും, പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് ഒരു ചുരുങ്ങിയ ഒരു 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 ടെക്സ്റ്റ്. ഞാൻ ഈ പുസ്തകം ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ എഴുതിയിരിക്കുന്ന ഒരു 40,000-45,000 ലിപികളേ ഉള്ളൂ, വാക്കുകളേ ഉള്ളൂ. അത് ഒരു ഷോർട്ട് ബുക്കാണ്. അതിനർത്ഥം ഈ പുസ്തകം അഥവാ വല്ലവർക്ക് നാരായണ ഗുരുവിനെ കുറിച്ച് കണ്ടുപിടിക്കാൻ ഒരു അത്യാവശ്യമായ എന്തൊക്കെയാണ് പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട വിഷയങ്ങൾ അറിയണമെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അവർക്ക് ഈ പുസ്തകം വായിച്ചാൽ കിട്ടും. പക്ഷേ എൻ്റെ ഉദ്ദേശം ഞാൻ തുടക്കത്തിൽ പറഞ്ഞ പോലെ പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് നാരായണ ഗുരുവിനെ കുറിച്ച് കേൾക്കാത്തവരും കൂടി ഉണ്ട് നോർത്ത് ഇന്ത്യയിൽ. നമ്മൾ ബോംബെയിലോ കൽക്കട്ടയിലോ ഡൽഹിയിലോ നിങ്ങളുടെ നോൺ മലയാളി സുഹൃത്തുക്കളുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങൾ ചോദിച്ചോളൂ. അവരാരും ആരാണ് ഇദ്ദേഹം ഒന്നും അറിയില്ല അവർക്ക്. അങ്ങനെയുള്ള ആൾക്കാരെ എത്താനാണ് ഞാൻ ഈ പുസ്തകം എഴുതിയിരിക്കുന്നത്. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലാണ് പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് വന്നിരിക്കുന്നത്.
സർ, ഞാൻ ആക്ച്വലി സാർ പറഞ്ഞ ഒരു പോയിന്റ് തന്നെയായിരുന്നു ചോദിക്കാൻ വന്നിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ നോർത്ത് ഇന്ത്യയിലുള്ള എനിക്കിപ്പോൾ ഒരുപാട് നോർത്ത് ഇന്ത്യൻ സുഹൃത്തുക്കളും എൻ്റെ ഒരുപാട് റിലേറ്റീവ്സും നോർത്ത് ഇന്ത്യയിലുണ്ട്. സോ അവിടെ ആൽഗോരിതംസ് പുഷ് ചെയ്യുന്ന എന്താ പറയുക റീൽസും മറ്റു കാര്യങ്ങളും ഫേസ്ബുക്കിലായിക്കോട്ടെ ഇൻസ്റ്റാഗ്രാമിലായിക്കോട്ടെ ഞാൻ കാണുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ സാർ ഇപ്പോൾ ഈ എഴുതിയ ബുക്ക് ശ്രീനാരായണ ഗുരുവിനെ പറ്റി അതിൻ്റെ ടൈറ്റിൽ തന്നെ ദ സേജ് ഹൂ റീഡിഫൈൻഡ് ഹിന്ദുയിസം എന്നാണ്. അപ്പോൾ കുറച്ചു കാലം മുമ്പ് സാറിൻ്റെ ഒരു ബുക്ക് കൂടി ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു, വൈ ആം എ ഹിന്ദു എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുള്ളത്. അപ്പോൾ ഈ രണ്ട് ബുക്കിനെയും കണക്ട് ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ട് മറ്റൊരു സ്പെസിഫിക് ഡീറ്റെയിലിനെയും കണക്ട് ചെയ്ത് ഒരു പ്രൊപ്പഗാൻഡ നോർത്തിൽ നടക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. അത് ഞാൻ ജസ്റ്റ് ഒന്ന് സൂചിപ്പിക്കാൻ ആഗ്രഹിക്കുന്നു. അപ്പോൾ ഞാൻ ഈ അടുത്ത് കണ്ടത് കഴിഞ്ഞ വർഷം സാറിൻ്റെ മടിയിൽ കയറിയിരുന്ന ഒരു കുരങ്ങൻ്റെ ഒരു ഫോട്ടോ. അപ്പോൾ അത് എടുത്ത് കാണിച്ചിട്ട് ഈ രണ്ട് സ്പെസിഫിക് ബുക്സിനെ പറ്റിയിട്ടും പറയുന്ന സംഭവം എന്താണെന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ, സാറ് ഒരു കട്ടർ ഹിന്ദു ആയതുകൊണ്ടും ഒരു ഹിന്ദു വിശ്വാസി ആയതുകൊണ്ടും സാറിനെ തെറ്റിൻ്റെ പാതയിൽ നിന്നും മാറ്റി BJP-യിലേക്ക് കൊണ്ടുവരാൻ വേണ്ടി ബജ്രംഗ് ബലി നേരിട്ട് വന്നതാണ് അത് എന്നൊരു പരാമർശമുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ അതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് എന്താണ് സാറിൻ്റെ അഭിപ്രായം?
അല്ല, അത് വായിക്കാത്തവരെ അങ്ങനെ സംസാരിക്കുള്ളൂ. കാരണം താങ്കൾ 25 പുസ്തകം വായിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്. താങ്കൾക്കറിയാം ഞാൻ വായാമ ഹിന്ദുവിൽ എഴുതിയത് എന്താണ്. അത് വെറും ഹിന്ദുവും സെക്യുലറിൻ്റെ ഇടയിലൊരു ചർച്ചയല്ല. ഹിന്ദുത്വ വേഴ്സസ് ഹിന്ദുയിസം ആണ് എൻ്റെ അഭിപ്രായം. ഹിന്ദു വിശ്വാസിയായിട്ട് ഞാൻ പറയുന്നു, ഈ ഹിന്ദുത്വ രാഷ്ട്രീയ മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ്, ഒരു പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ മൂവ്മെൻറ്റാണ് ഹിന്ദുത്വ. അത് ചെയ്യുന്നത് തെറ്റാണെന്ന് സ്ഥാപിക്കാനാണ് ഞാൻ വായമ ഹിന്ദു എന്ന് എഴുതിയത്. അത് വായിച്ച് മനസ്സിലാക്കാത്തവർ ടൈറ്റിൽ മാത്രം കണ്ടിട്ട് എന്നെ ഒരു കട്ടർ ഹിന്ദുവാക്കി മാറ്റി വെച്ചു. എൻ്റെ ഹിന്ദു വിശ്വാസം വിവേകാനന്ദൻ്റെയും ആദിശങ്കരുടെയും നാരായണ ഗുരുവിൻ്റെയും ഹിന്ദു മതമാണ്, ഹിന്ദു ധർമ്മമാണ്. അപ്പോൾ ഞാൻ പറയുന്ന എല്ലാവരെയും ഉൾക്കൊള്ളുന്ന ഒരു ഹിന്ദുയിസം, അത് ഹിന്ദുത്വ മൂവ്മെൻറ്റിൻ്റെ രാഷ്ട്രീയ ഐഡിയോളജിയിൽ ഒരു ബന്ധമില്ല. അത് നിങ്ങൾ മനസ്സിൽ ക്ലിയറായി സ്പഷ്ടമായി വെക്കണം. Just a brief answer to explain that I see a lot of these issues as a debate within Hinduism between the advocates of a political doctrine called Hindutva and those who believe in the Hinduism of Adi Shankara, Vivekananda, Narayana Guru and others. And I speak very much from the latter camp, against the distortions of Hindu faith and belief that I believe are being practiced for political ends by the Hindutva movement. And that's a lot of what my writing has been about. So the caricaturing of me as some sort of Hindu, whatever word you want, Kattar Hindu, as he said, is simply not accurate. That's a one-sentence summary of the exchange we just had. Right. We started 3 minutes late, so let's give one more question at least, because I do believe that while the audience was settling down, we missed out.
My question is that, would you say that the United Nations, especially the United Nations Security Council, is rather becoming a vestigial organ in a rising multipolar world? Do you actually think that the UN can acknowledge countries which are having unique and complex relations similar to India? Or, in your words, will the UN be able to fully acknowledge, integrate, and accept multi-aligned countries? Thank you.
So you're very sweet to ask this question. It's a vast topic that has nothing to do with the book before discussion. So if you Google my writings, I've addressed all your questions. Let's give this lady who wants to ask about the book a chance. Just give the mic to this lady so we get a second question about the book. And for the young student, there is a lot there. Literally go on Google, search for me, United Nations, multi-alignment. You'll get a lot there. The answers are available, but it's not relevant to this audience right now. Yeah.
Thank you, sir, firstly. My name is Divya.
Hold it higher, I can't
My
hear.
name is Divya.
Right.
And my question is, throughout the discussion, I couldn't just help not
Little holder.
I couldn't just not think about a parallel between the way Sree Narayana Guru has set up the temple and the a school and then, teachings and all that. And all the new things that we see around, all the demigods and semi-gods mushrooming all around in India, and the organizations associated with it. And then slowly they spread into, propaganda and then educational field, and how they start impacting the society. I think being a politician and who has an in-depth knowledge in religion and history and everything, you are the right person to address that. Where would you place the book in this context in the current India, considering all the, you got it right. So, yeah.
So, ma'am, the truth is, any set of ideas and beliefs, any philosophical values can be used, misused, reused for political purposes by anyone. I mean, that once Sree Narayana Guru has put his message out in the world, he no longer controls how it is used. In fact, some in the left criticized him. I've quoted an essay by Amos Nambudripad attacking his bourgeois values and so on. And there are some in the left who were his disciples, Sahodharan Ayyappan, for example, who took his ideas further into a very strongly leftist orientation in Kerala politics. And there are many who would argue that the identification of the Uyava community with the communists in Kerala can be traced in a direct line of descent. Deshabhimani was started as a newspaper supporting his ideas before the Communist Party even existed, and was revived by one of his disciples and became then subsequently a sort of house organ of the Communist Party of India, Marxist. So you can actually see an appropriation or misappropriation by the left. You can certainly see some of these ideas being appropriated by the right. We, for example, seen BJP openly appealing on the grounds, every time you have a Sree Narayana Guru birthday or Jayanti, you will find some BJP voices will come and say, he was the man who liberated the OBCs. We are OBCs. We have an OBC prime minister. We now have to support Sree Narayana Guru by voting for our party. So everybody can use everything for every point of view. I'm just saying that ultimately what you as a reader derive from his lessons, his teachings and legacies, up to you. And it's what you then take forward as an individual citizen of India. What he has done is he has empowered you to do that. He has, through his service, given every Indian citizen the opportunity to pursue their freedom and their self-realization in their own way, and that would also apply to politics. Certainly, my own interpretation will differ, and you have already hinted at some of my disagreements, but others will conceivably use some of the things he said for a totally opposite point of view, and that is the wonderful thing. You remember the old line from Shakespeare, the devil can quote the scriptures for his purpose. Anybody can quote anybody, including Sree Narayana Guru. Read the book and see what you want to derive from it. Thanks very much.
Thank you from both of us.